Now, quite some time ago, I made a video about metal detectors, and looking back, I think that video lacks a lot of pretty interesting detail about these devices. So I want to have another go at this. I've actually wanted to have another go at this for quite some time. And we're going to do that today by building a metal detector from scratch, and then we're also going to try to use that to actually find some things.
I should have brought a bigger shovel for this.
Generally speaking, metal detectors work by producing some kind of changing or alternating magnetic field, and then when a piece of metal comes in, that somehow disturbs that magnetic field a bit, and that disturbance can be detected, and that's how it knows that there is a piece of metal nearby. Now, there's a lot of different types of metal detectors out there, but generally speaking, that is the principle on which it relies. Now, in its simplest form, you can do this using just a single coil. So in this type of metal detector, you have one coil of wire, you send an alternating current through that coil so that it makes an alternating magnetic field, and then when a piece of metal comes in, that's going to affect that magnetic field and therefore change the inductance of that coil, and that change in inductance can then be sensed using various types of electronic circuit. Now, most metal detectors on the market, however, that you can buy will use multiple coils, typically two of them. So in this case, you're going to have one coil which is your transmitter, which is responsible for producing a magnetic field, and then the other one is your receiver, which is responsible for listening, right, or sensing the magnetic field, and more importantly, sensing changes in the magnetic field that might happen when a piece of metal comes in. Now, within this group of two coil metal detectors, there is one subtype that is extremely popular, which is called the double D design. And the reason why it's called that, I mean, like, this is what it looks like, okay? So that's why it's called the double D metal detector. And the cool thing about this is that because these coils are overlapping a little bit, the net magnetic flux through your receiver coil is normally zero. So if you look at this picture, you can see that through one side of the receiver coil you have flux going that way essentially, and through the other side of the receiver coil you have the magnetic flux going the opposite way. And so those two cancel each other out so that the net magnetic flux through the coil is normally nothing. And that means there is, normally speaking, no output signal from this coil, at least in an ideal scenario, right? And then when a piece of metal comes in and it sort of changes the shape of that magnetic field, that's going to throw off this balance. So now you can have more or less magnetic flux going through either one of those two sides, and that means the net magnetic flux is no longer zero, and so now you're going to have an output signal from this coil. So it's really quite an elegant and clever design. And it is also the design that I want to use for my metal detector. So what I've done is I've already made these small bits of electronic circuitry, I guess you could call them modules or something like that, which when put together will form a fully functioning metal detector. So what I want to do now is go over to the hardware that I've got set up so that we can see all of these things do their job, so we can walk through all of the electronic circuitry and validate that it all works. And then once we know that it works, we can put it all together and build a wonderful little metal detector, which we can then use to find all kinds of expensive things, hopefully. So right here we've got a whole bunch of parts that we're going to turn into a metal detector. So what I've done is I've printed out the schematics for all of this stuff so that I can show you exactly how this all works, and these will also be available for you to download if you want to replicate this thing yourself. So it all starts off with the signal generator, which is the part that actually generates the carrier signal that's going to be put into our transmitter coil, and that's this little thing over here. So on the schematic it looks like this. So First of all, we've got an oscillator that produces a square wave, so that's just an operational amplifier, the LM324, surrounded by a whole bunch of passive components. The moment you power it on, it starts producing a square wave output signal. And the frequency of that square wave signal can be adjusted as well by changing the value of this adjustable resistor over here. Now for this project we're going to use a frequency of 12.5 kilohertz, so I've already set that to 12.5 kilohertz. Now then that square wave goes into this passive filtering circuit over here, so just a couple of resistors and capacitors, which turn it into a smooth sine wave. And then finally that sine wave goes through this potentiometer so that you can adjust the amplitude, and finally through a capacitor over here which strips off the DC component that the signal has, because we don't want to be feeding DC into the next part of our circuit. So over here we've got a little test pin which is the output signal from our square wave oscillator, and if I hook the scope up to that you can see the square wave that it produces. So then if I take the scope probe and probe the output of the signal generator, we can see, if we just zoom in a little bit, that is what our output signal looks like. So it's not quite perfect, as you might be able to tell, but it's pretty good, so I'm quite pleased with that. With a bit more aggressive filter values you could probably get it a bit cleaner still, but I think this is good enough. So this signal then needs to be amplified before it goes into our transmitter coil, and to do this I simply use an audio amplifier. So right here is an audio amplifier module that I bought at an electronics shop. So these are like little modules you can buy. People use this to make Bluetooth speakers and stuff like that. They're very cheap and it's pretty good for this application. So that just takes the signal, amplifies it, and then sends it into our transmitter coil, which is this one over here. Now speaking of our transmitter coil, it is about that big. I'll put on the video what the actual size is. I haven't measured it up to this point, but it is 10 turns of copper wire and it has an inductance of approximately 60 microhenries. And then for the receiving coil we're using exactly the same physical size, but it's using a bit thinner wire, and it has double the turns, so it has 20 turns instead of 10. Now I've tested it with a 10 turn receiver coil as well. That also works. This seems to work just a bit better, but there is not a huge difference between the two. For me this is the configuration that worked best. So you can see that we've got the receiver coil hooked up to the receiving circuit over here. So this little guy is responsible for actually sensing the changes in the magnetic field and allowing us to detect metal. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hook up the scope to the input of the receiving circuit, so essentially to the coil, right? So that now shows us what the receiving coil is seeing. And now we need to very carefully adjust their position to get the voltage or the output voltage of the receiver to be as close to 0 as possible. Oh, there you go. So you can see that the scope is now set to a 10 millivolt scale. So every box on this screen is now 10 millivolts. So the signal is now probably like what is it? 2.5 or something, like a crazy small number. So we're just going to grab another circuit diagram here. There you go. So what we've got over here is our receiver coil. Then first of all there is a low pass filter which filters out any high frequency noise that might be present, which is actually not that big of a problem, but just put it in there just in case. Then we have two stages of amplification. So again we're using the LM324 operational amplifier, and we're using two stages of that to amplify the signal, because it's a super small signal, right? It's only 10 millivolts. So like we need a huge amount of gain to get it to some useful level, which is why we're using two stages. And then after that, what we do is we rectify that signal so that it becomes DC using a diode. And so that gives us essentially a DC voltage that changes whenever a piece of metal comes nearby. Now, what is that high-pass filter for at the end? Well, the thing is, as you've been able to see, the adjustment of these coils, their physical position, is very, very critical. Like the slightest movement, the slightest offset ruins the whole thing. So essentially what that high-pass filter does, right there, is it makes sure that only changes in this DC voltage get passed on to the output. So if the coils are not quite perfectly aligned and there is some, baseline signal level, that will sort of get blocked by the high-pass filter, and only when there is a change, for instance when a piece of metal comes in, that will be passed on to the output. So if I just remove the scope for a bit, what happens is after that high-pass filter, it then goes through one more final stage of amplification right here before it gets passed on to the output. So finally, what we need to do is convert the output signal from this circuit into something that we can actually see. And for that, I've made a simple LED indicator. So it's just a couple of LEDs wired together, and the higher the output voltage is, the more of these LEDs will turn on. So we could just plug that into our output signal like this. I'm just going to have to use a scope here to sort of reposition the coils properly. There you go. So you can see the LEDs are now pretty much off. I mean, the red one is flickering just a tiny bit, but that's okay. Now if I bring the piece of metal in, you can see that the LEDs turn on. So the detection range for this thing is about 25-30 centimeters right now. So I'm hoping we can get a bit more range out of it once we properly mount these coils. But you can see that the metal detector is working now. So that means we can now move on to actually assembling this thing into a proper metal detector. Okay, so what I've done is I've made this little sort of wooden box for the coils to go in. So as you can see, I've put the coils inside the box. And now what I'm going to do is, using my scope, I'm going to adjust the position of the coils to get that as close to 0 as I can. And then I'm going to glue them in place using my hot glue gun. And then hopefully we'll have those coils secured in there. And then we close this off, and then hopefully it all stays in place. Wrong way round. Let's do that again. Right, so the homemade metal detector is now fully assembled, and it actually works pretty well. So for medium-sized objects like this flask here, the detection range is about 30 to 40 centimeters or so, which is actually pretty deep. Now obviously for much smaller items, like a little coin for instance, that range goes down a lot. It becomes about 10, maybe 15 centimeters. Which again is a lot less, but in my opinion still pretty usable. Okay, so now then, as I've promised in the beginning of this video, it is time to take our new metal detector and go out on a treasure hunt. Okay, so I have arrived in the woods and I've got my metal detector over here. So let's see if we can find some nice objects. Oh, you see that? Something is here. We are actually getting a very good response. I'm expecting this to be something quite big actually. Let me see if we can find what it is. Would you look at that? Sardines and oil. Not sponsored. Anyway, see if we can find something better. Oh, look. There's something. Okay. Let's take a look what it is. So it's like right here, according to my detector. So let's just get the shovel out and dig a little hole. Still there. It seems to be a bit more towards this side of the hole. Oh, actually, there it is. An old tube. I mean, whoever used this did get the maximum value out of this product, wherever it has been. Like it's been used properly. Anyway, we don't need that. I think we've got another hit. See that? There is a very, very faint response. What's this? So I just cleaned the dirt off a little bit and I realised this is actually from a shotgun round, I think. You can see it's made by FN, which is the Belgian firearms manufacturer. I found something again. I tell you, this place is full of stuff. It's mostly useless stuff, but there is a lot of stuff here. I should have brought a bigger shovel for this. So would you look at this? It appears to be some kind of like upright sitting can that someone's dug into the ground. It's actually like, look at that, there is an empty space in there, it's not filled up. Let's see if we can get it out.
So I just had to put the camera away for a second because I needed to use both my hands for this. But it turns out it was actually a jar made out of glass, and then the lid on the jar was a piece of metal which the detector responded to. And there's another jar sitting over here right next to it. I'm just going to see if I can pull that out as well. There's nothing in the jar except for a bit of mud, so that's a disappointment. I was secretly hoping for someone to have stored their treasure in this underground jar, but unfortunately that doesn't seem to be the case. So I just finished digging up the second jar too, and it is also empty. So this was a completely useless exercise, I guess. I think I'm going to go home now because I think I've demonstrated well enough that the metal detector does in fact work. I had hoped to dig up some more spectacular finds, but you know, you can't be lucky every time, can you? So that kind of wraps it up for today's video. I hope you've enjoyed watching it. I would highly encourage you to try and build one of these yourself because it's actually great fun, and it's also really cheap, right? This is a metal detector that works quite well actually, and it costs, I don't know, I think less than 30 euros to build. There won't be many metal detectors on the market that can do better value for money than this, and even if they do, you won't have the satisfaction of finding stuff with a device that you've built yourself. So yeah, if you're looking for a nice project, there's one I'd highly recommend you try for yourself. And of course there's all kinds of upgrades you could do to this design to make it a lot better than my version. Anyway, as I've said, hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, please subscribe. And of course, thank you very much for watching.